Hello and welcome to Insight. Today we have with us somebody who has been at the forefront of the fight against Hinduphobia in the West. She's also the co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. Many of you must already know her, Suhag Shukla. Today on Insight we discuss what really is Hinduphobia and what it is not, and what its real motivations are. We also discuss the question of caste in America, which, after the infamous Cisco case, has come into limelight. Join us today as we try to unravel what are the real biases against Hindus and India in the West. Suhag, welcome to Insight. It is such a privilege for me to have you on. You were in Delhi, and there was no way that I would not make sure that you would come on Insight. So I'm really glad that you could take the time out.
Thanks for having me.
Suhag, let me start by asking you about your organization, HAF. How did you start it? What was the need for you to start?
Sure. Well, the 4 to 6 of us co-founders, most of us were born and raised in the United States, grew up in very active communities that were engaged in teaching us about our tradition and culture, preserving it, passing it on to the next generation. And in knowing that firsthand experience from what our parents gave us, from what we gathered on our trips back to India, we realized that there was a real disconnect between how we saw ourselves, how we saw our cultures and traditions, and how the mainstream America did, whether it was our classmates, whether as we grew up to become professionals, how it was professionals, how the media was presenting India. There was a real disconnect. And it could really be summed down into this caste cow karma stereotype, right? Most of how India and especially Hinduism were viewed or presented in the media and policy spaces, wherever mainstream America was getting their information, was deeply informed by these negative, reductive stereotypes. So as we were talking about these things, complaining about them really, Mihir Meghani, one of our co-founders, had already been doing a lot of work with the Jewish community. And he saw that one of the key differences that made the Jewish community successful was a professionalized approach. To have staff that have the credentials to be able to speak in the areas where narratives are being shaped and formed, where policies are being created and passed, that we needed that sort of institution to now build a bridge essentially between our mandirs, our balvihars, our cultural and artistic institutions that the first generation has built to mainstream institutions like the US Congress, whether it's the mainstream media or textbook publishers or state governments that are shaping these types of policies that impact the community day in and day out. And so that's what we did.
That's amazing. Everybody has heard about you in India, and everybody has heard about the work that your organization has done. But for our audience, could you tell us what are the ways that you've bridged this gap and this attitude, or how you've attempted to do so?
Absolutely. So HAF, I think one of our key strengths is that we're nonpartisan and that we focus on both education and advocacy. Both of those things are really constructive ways in which you can address challenges. Challenges about how Hinduism is portrayed in public school curriculum or in the media, how Hindu issues or issues that are impacting Hindus, both in the United States as an ethnic religious minority, or even giving voice to Hindus around the world who are minorities in places like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, giving voice to them, to US policymakers to ensure the well-being of Hindus in both domestically and internationally, and also in engaging in these conversations that are ongoing, whether it's things like climate change globally, or whether we're talking about things like gun safety reform in the United States. We believe that the Hindu tradition and our philosophy and teachings of unity, of inclusivity, of pluralism, all have a real transformative potential to really solving some of these pressing issues that are facing humanity.
Absolutely. I saw your presentation the other day, which was, by the way, a brilliant presentation. Uh, we still saw, and you'd given us some snippets of this event that happened in America called Dismantling Global Hindutva, where eventually what the conclusion of the entire event seemed to be was to dismantle Hinduism. Um, how is it that this, in this day and age, can still take place without offending billions of people, but also how is it that Hindu phobia is so prevalent in the West?
That's a good question. I think that we need to recognize where at least that particular form of Hinduphobia was coming from. It was actually coming from other Hindus, right? Other people of Indian origin. And so it kind of stays under the radar. It's more difficult for people who would ordinarily be our allies. So if, for instance, there's an attack on a Hindu mandir or a temple in the United States, and say it was done by a white nationalist group, you would have hordes of Americans who believe in pluralism, who believe that diversity is a good thing for any society, coming out in support. But when you have something like Dismantling Global Hindutva, which was to me not an academic event, but it was a partisan event, right? These are people who are politically and ideologically motivated, people, specifically academic scholars, who have gripes with what the political realities are here. And they're utilizing their positions of power and privilege to assert a particular viewpoint. And who becomes the collateral damage is their Hindu students on campus. Who becomes a collateral damage are their colleagues who may not be in the humanities, who may not be in the South Asia studies departments. But because from its first appearance, it looks like it's academic, and you take advantage of the general unfamiliarness or unfamiliarity that the average American has about India and Hinduism, you have a perfect opening to do this sort of thing.
Correct. It's almost like some sort of crisis, propagation of this sort of crisis situation, which gets people to get up and notice and, immediately take sides. But having said that, Hinduphobia also has many different aspects, and you spoke about this the other day. Could you explain to us a little bit of what really is Hinduphobia and what it isn't? Because I think that's really important in order to not dilute really what impacts us.
As a lawyer, I think that language and, a common understanding around language is so important. And so at the Hindu American Foundation, we've actually adopted a working or a working definition that was created by academics at a conference held at Rutgers. And it's available on understandinghinduphobia.org. And in order for us to, first of all, recognize Hinduphobia, we need to know what it might entail. And it's a really comprehensive definition that I don't have memorized. So that's why I encourage people to go to the website. But as a lawyer, what I saw that was really helpful about this definition is that it had essentially two elements. In law school, we learn about the elements of a crime. What are the different factors that need to be met in order to prove that something was a crime or not? Obviously, evidence and all those things become a part of it. So in this working definition, what's clear is intent and impact. And the impact can be easy. It might be delegitimizing concerns. It might be desecrating our symbols. It might be destroying things. So especially in places like Pakistan or Bangladesh, where you have destruction of ancient Hindu temples, right? Those are examples of the impact. The intent is oftentimes what's the more subtle thing. What's driving this? And that's where I think it's important to take a look at every single instant that comes your way or where you're engaging on social media to say, okay, this is the impact that might be that yes, it's delegitimizing the concerns. But if the reason that someone made a statement in a particular way is out of ignorance, is it really Hinduphobia as opposed to it's maybe ideologically driven, right? What are some of the different ideologies that are very often at the root of Hinduphobic statements, Hinduphobic actions? You have religious exclusivism, you might have racism, you might have colonialism, Marxism, as well as postmodernism, right? So if that's where you're finding that the comment is coming from one of these ideologies, it makes it a little bit easier to then call it out, create an argument around why it's Hinduphobic, and then be able to convince even non-Hindus to stand out against and speak out against that particular statement or whatever might be happening.
Right. So I would believe that there are probably different dimensions to Hinduphobia as well, in respect to political Hinduphobia or religious Hinduphobia. There seems to be this sort of concern about a democratically elected government in India. You know, there seems to be a concern of like a muscular Hinduism. How would the approaches be different towards both these types of phobias?
That's a good question. I think where we've found the best results in calling something out that's this kind of political Hinduphobia is turning to partners in the Jewish community, because they have seen this for far longer. I would say that there was kind of a rolling, like a gentle boil, and then it came into a spillover after 2014 in terms of the type of politicized Hinduphobia that we see in things like dismantling global Hindutva. So where the Jewish community has seen that we need to make a distinction between legitimate criticism about specific policies of, say, the Israeli government, and then when it very quickly veers into anti-Semitism, right? When you are making broad sweeping statements about an entire religious community or an ethnic community, you can't really say it's a legitimate criticism. Sure. So you could say the same thing about India and legitimate criticism about specific policies that one may disagree with. But when you make broad sweeping claims about all Hindus being evil, being violent, being dangerous, being anathema to pluralistic democracies, well, that's where you've very quickly veered into Hinduphobia.
Correct. But would you say that because the kind of attacks that I've seen on the government in India or even uh, religious bodies, would you say this is a result of lack of awareness amongst Americans or in the West? Or would you say that this is a malicious, targeted attack on Hinduism and India, and what India stands for today, which seems to be threatening the West?
It's a complex answer to a complex question. I talked about the other day vertical hostility and horizontal hostility. Vertical hostility is kind of the external challenges that come in the form or are driving Hinduphobia. Horizontal is when it's coming from within the community. And when I mean within the community, I mean other people of Indian origin. Very often what's happening, say in the US Congress, if you get these ludicrous statements about impending genocide, for instance, in India, right? Those are being driven by people who are politically and ideologically opposed to the current government, who themselves are of Indian origin. And then they are able to take advantage of the unfamiliarity of, say, the average American lawmaker, right? And using language that's also then supported by a media ecosystem that also perpetuates those things, because it's the same kind of political ideologues that are spinning those stories that are oftentimes completely disconnected from the ground realities, right? So it's far more complex in that sense that you have, it still is rooted in this political opposition. So they're trying to fight their battles because they may have lost them here in India, trying to fight them from abroad. What happens is that Indian and Hindu Americans become the collateral damage. What do I, as someone who was born and raised in the United States, have anything to do with Indian politics? But because of all this confusion, intentional misinformation, we as a foundation have had to step up to provide evidence-based understanding of India to members of Congress, because someone has to counter what, all the misinformation. So that is kind of the reality.
That's really eloquently explained, but like you said, you've had to step up and you've had to show the data and you've had to have like rigorous amount of research in what you put out there. Let me bring you to the recent controversy, or the recent misinformation that has been going around the caste system. This has become something big in America. Everybody's talking about it, and somehow the caste system's only associated to Hinduism. It's been portrayed as the foundation of Hinduism. Now, on one end, you as an organization has to give in, very rigorous sort of, data and facts and, reports. Whereas a lot of this was based on a very flimsy report by Equality Labs. I've been through that report. There was something like 1,500 respondents, most of them not in India, not in America, and they were anonymous, so they couldn't really verify it. But this became the foundation of a lot of dialogue on the caste system.
They also threw out responses, from what I understand in reading a footnote in actually the Carnegie Endowment
Yes,
report, that they threw out responses where someone didn't necessarily identify by caste. Correct. So you're talking about sample bias, snowball effect. I mean, every statistical error in the book, plus the fact that at least one of the newsletters said, if you don't live in the San Francisco Bay Area, you can use this zip code, so yeah, I think that this is to me, the institutionalizing of caste as a non-discrimination policy, whether it's on college campuses. Right now we have a pending lawsuit against the Cal State University system that has some 20 plus campuses across the state of California. So we're talking about tens of thousands of students, many of whom, because California has a large Indian and Hindu American population, where these students, as well as the faculty on these campuses, could be implicated by these policies. So what the basis of non-discrimination law in the United States is that there are certain protected classes, certain bases upon which you cannot discriminate against an individual in the workplace, in college admissions, in public accommodations. And so the law protects these categories. The categories are race, national origin, ethnicity, and ancestry are part of national origin. You have gender, you have age. Some places might have physical disability. The beauty and the elegance, in my view as an attorney, of these categories is that they're facially neutral, meaning that they don't elicit in the mind of any individual a particular perpetuator of discrimination and a particular victim of discrimination. Any person arguably can have protection under these facially neutral categories.
And why do you need a separate?
Exactly. And the key thing here is that, look, if someone has faced caste-based discrimination, we condemn it. It's an opposition to the core fundamental Hindu ideas of divinity within all individuals and having equal regard for one another. But more importantly, existing policies would already protect against it, because national origin, in the way that the courts have interpreted this category, include things like descent, ancestry, accent, all of these things that potentially might be triggered in any ideas or notions of caste. But what caste as a specific category does is that it's facially discriminatory, meaning that it is associated with only people of Indian origin, and all of the activism leading up to the addition of these categories by college administrators talked about just the South Asian community, talked about this as a big problem in the South Asian community without evidence, mind you, as you pointed out. And so you now have institutionalized a category that's calling for basically the ethno-religious policing of a segment. So you are violating your own non-discrimination policy with a new category in it. And that doesn't even speak to now the implicit bias that's been institutionalized. If I have a choice between admitting an Indian student or an Indian descent student and say a Latino student, and I see the Indian student and I say, oh, wait a minute, this group is so inherently bigoted that we had to create these special policies, remember? Why would you? They have a legal liability. They already have a negative perception now attached to them. How is that not going to inadvertently impact them in an adverse manner? So this is where the problem lies. The other key issue is, well, 2 points. One is that many of these university administrators admitted that they've not had a single complaint of caste-based discrimination. So they did it in the absence of not only evidence of widespread caste-based discrimination. We're 2% of the entire US population, but that existing policy failed. And the third point is
But
yeah.
let me add to this. There are universities like Ivy League universities, like Harvard, that have institutionalized this. Now, these are universities that one would think are based in the rigor of academia and data, and if they didn't have this, and if, let's say, Quality Labs report was something that they went by, how can they justify it?
Right. Well, to my third point, the fact is that there's very little data on caste identities, whatever. But the one report that's out there, the one that has actually been conducted in a at least somewhat rigorous manner. I think I have some issues in the way that questions were asked. Every survey can have improvements, but the Carnegie survey has found that caste identities become less and less salient with each coming generation. We know that even just anecdotally. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that people reporting in that survey reported the reports or the results were that caste-based discrimination is exceedingly rare.
Correct.
What people face more is religion and racial discrimination more than anything else. The justification, I think, is that academia is in a very strange space right now, especially in the humanities, especially in the social sciences, where political activism, thinking in binaries, teaching students not how to think, but what to think, and really trying to kind of inculcate political ideology rather than independent thinking is something that's become so prevalent, where a diversity of opinions and viewpoints are not welcome. So these policies kind of become a reflection of that general environment on many college campuses, especially liberal college campuses.
Absolutely, because when I looked into the kind of backgrounds of the students that had really pushed for this, I was surprised that a lot of them were really politically motivated, were openly anti the present dispensation in India, which to me raised a big red flag, because it makes me question your motivation.
Absolutely. And the other challenge becomes that the average second or third generation Indian American student, Hindu American student, isn't well versed on the politics
Correct.
of India. They're also not well versed with the idea of caste. This has been one of the most reductive but prevalent stereotypes that fundamentally shape the understanding of India, of Indian society, and specifically Hinduism. I mean, from sixth grade onwards, we have a picture of a pyramid in our textbooks with Brahmins on top and everyone else down, as if there's this priestly class that dominates Indian society, has done so in the past, continues to do so now. That's a Protestant view of society, and it reduced a very highly complex, right, system. I like to picture Indian society almost like a helix formation where you just, or like the inside of a nucleus where you have all these different atoms and sometimes they collate this way or this way, or that would be a far better depiction of not just Indian society. I mean, any human society is going to be complex. Yet this reductive way is still the way in which Indian society is understood, because that reductive manner actually got institutionalized in India first through the legal system. And so you have this entrenchment of certain ideas and stereotypes that aren't reflective of ground realities. We don't have to deny the fact that there is social discrimination in Indian society, just like there is in any society. But what the root cause is gets obscured by this prevalent paradigm.
Correct. Um, Additionally, there's been an infamous case, the Cisco case. So it doesn't limit this sort of debate on caste does not limit itself to students, but also now has permeated into the workspace. Could you give us a little detail about this case?
Absolutely. So we have actually two pending lawsuits. One is against Cal State University, and there the legal premise for our complaint is a denial of equal protection, that the CSU or the Cal State University policy singles out and targets for disparate treatment students of Indian or South Asian origin. In the Cisco case, what's happened is that the state sued Cisco and named two Indian origin defendants, accusing them of engaging in caste-based discrimination. Now, some of the facts of the case, which are publicly available, seem pretty flimsy in terms of whether the state really has a legitimate claim. I have reason to believe from court records that the state may be ready to dismiss the claim, at least against the two specific defendants, after such a media blitz on a case. I mean, that's not normal. Most employment discrimination cases go on every day, and there's not this big media craze. I mean, you can do a Google search and see how many stories have been written about this, right? So if you look at the most recent filings, it looks like the state showed some indication of at least dropping the two defendant names. You don't do that if you had a strong case, you don't do that, right? But in that particular case, what the state has done is that they have defined the caste system as a Hindu religious and social hierarchy in which apparently all of us Hindus are mandated by social custom or legal mandate to discriminate against one another on the basis of our caste. So the heart of religious freedom under the Constitution in America is that the state or any state entity cannot interpret or define religious doctrine. By defining caste and a caste system as inherent or intrinsic Hindu practices and teachings, they've done exactly that. So in our case against the state of California arising out of the Cisco situation is that the state of California is violating the religious freedom and the religious rights as well as equal protection by treating Hinduism differently than they treat any other religious tradition. And that's the basis, the constitutional basis of that lawsuit.
Well, best of luck for that. I think it would make a great example of how things can be convoluted without, real knowledge. But now coming to the end of my questions, I've always believed in the importance of using the right nomenclature that really differentiates, and gives us clarity. You have used predatory proselytization before. What does that mean? What does that signify? And why do you use the word predatory?
So, predatory proselytization is a term that we coined several years ago as we were putting together our white paper uh, on predatory practices. And the reason we use predatory is that in the United States, things like predatory lending, predatory advertising, um, these sort of practices are frowned upon because you have a imbalance of power and you are taking advantage of some sort of vulnerability. And so, whether it's predatory advertising, that might be, say, cigarettes. Cigarettes advertised to children using a cartoon would be considered predatory advertising because you are kind of manipulating your narrative, your approach in order to prey upon the vulnerabilities of a segment of the population. When we talk about predatory proselytization, we were looking at all of the Western evangelical movements that are, on a soul harvest in many parts of India. And you look at the way in which they're proselytizing, where healthcare or education are used as the bait, so to speak, to target very vulnerable communities, right? And so the reason that we put the word predatory around it is as we're engaging with other Christians, because we work with all faith communities, proselytization in and of itself is actually something that many of them engage in as a means of their religious practice. So to say that proselytization is unethical is not a good starting point with someone who actually believes that that's my religious practice to proselytize. However, when we insert a word like predatory to it, all of a sudden that changes the conversation. And in fact, we started finding that more pluralistic Christians were equally concerned about these practices coming towards even them because they were not Christian enough. And so that allowed us to find allies, even in Christian communities, who would stand with us to say, this is wrong and we should stand out against this. It's actually unchristian to engage in these types of practices.
Suhag, coming to my last question, I have seen that you've taken a lot of tough stances, you've used a lot of tough words, and you've really been at the forefront of fighting Hinduphobia, if I may say so. Um, when you were here day before yesterday to give your presentation, immediately there were a lot of known, the usual suspects, yes, who were on your case. Um, is there more sort of targeted attacks that HAF has endured in the past with your work, or
Yeah.
directed towards you?
Absolutely. I've been called all sorts of things, but they don't reflect who I am. So I just try to let them roll off my back. Of course, it does get tiring after a while. They are hurtful. But I see it as, because I am an optimist, I like to always find a silver lining. If we weren't as effective as we are as an organization, they wouldn't be attacking us. And so to me, in order to deal with those types of attacks and not react, but to be able to respond in not just an intelligent manner, in a thoughtful manner, but also a dharmic manner, which I think is the foundation of it all, I have to know that they're coming out of a place of fear or a place of hate. And both of those things, either you're going to be able to change it or you're not. But there's a lot of people who are watching who are neutral observers. So I just stick with our ethics, our guiding principles, and that's what the rest of us at HAF do. We're very fortunate to have a team that is really just eye on the goal of serving this cause, of ensuring that there's a more respectful and authentic and accurate understanding of Hindus and Hinduism. And that just kind of becomes our North Star, and that's what we're guided by. We try not to forget that we need to imbibe the values of the tradition that we're trying to protect and preserve.
It's absolutely amazing to me, the work that you do, and it's also amazing to me to see the amount of intolerance amongst the people who speak the most about tolerance.
Yes, exactly.
But thank you so much, Suhag, for taking the time out, being here with us, and I hope to have you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's my
Bye.
pleasure. Namaste.
That was Suhag Shukla from the Hindu American Foundation. Clearly, after my discussion with her, it seems that Hinduphobia is a reality and it is rampant. Not just because of misinformation or lack of awareness, but because of malicious intent. Sure, go and read the Equality Labs report or the Cisco case and make up your own mind. But at the end, one must be grateful that there are organizations like Hindu American Foundation and people like Suhag Shukla who are at the forefront of clearing these false narratives. Thank you for watching. Until next time.